The first thing I remember is the echo of my husband's voice, sharp and venomous, ricocheting off the marble walls of the courtroom. "Get the hell out of my life," he bellowed, his face twisted in a mask of rage I barely recognized. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The judge's gavel hovered in the air. The bailiff's eyes widened, and the gallery filled with strangers, lawyers, and a few familiar faces collectively held its breath. I felt every gaze burning into me, as if I were a spectacle, a woman on trial not just for her marriage, but for her very existence. I wanted to disappear. My cheeks burned, my hands trembled in my lap, and I could feel my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I tried to steady my breathing, to remind myself that I was here for a reason, that I had prepared for this day. But nothing could have prepared me for the humiliation of being screamed at by the man I once trusted with my life, in front of a room full of people who would go home and tell this story over dinner. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, fixed my husband with a look that could have melted steel. "Mr. Carter, you will control yourself in my courtroom," she said, her voice calm but edged with warning. But he was beyond reason, his anger spilling over, fueled by months, maybe years of resentment and bitterness. I wondered, not for the first time, how we had come to this. How had the man who once whispered promises in the dark become the stranger who now wanted to erase me from his life with a single public outburst? My attorney leaned in, whispering, "Don't react. Let him dig his own grave." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, determined not to give my husband the satisfaction of seeing me break. But inside, I was unraveling. Every word he hurled was a stone, chipping away at the foundation of the life I thought we'd built together. The courtroom was a theater, and I was the unwilling star of a tragedy I never auditioned for. My husband's lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, tried to regain control, but my husband waved him off, his eyes wild. "She's a liar. She's been hiding things from me for years," he shouted, his voice cracking. The judge's gavel finally came down, the sharp crack slicing through the tension. "Enough," the judge said, her tone brooking no argument. "This is a court of law, not a circus. If you cannot conduct yourself appropriately, I will have you removed." My husband glared at her, but for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a woman in authority. I glanced at the gallery, searching for a friendly face, but found only curiosity and judgment. My mother sat in the back row, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I wanted to run to her, to bury my face in her shoulder and let her tell me everything would be all right. But I was alone on this stage, and the show had only just begun. The judge turned her attention to me, her gaze softening just a fraction. "Mrs. Carter, do you have anything to say in response?" My mouth felt dry, my voice small. "No, Your Honor," I managed, forcing myself to meet her eyes. I would not let him see me cry, not here. "Not now," my husband scoffed, shaking his head. "Of course she doesn't. She never has anything to say, unless it's behind my back." His words stung, but I refused to flinch. I had spent too many years shrinking myself to fit his expectations, too many nights wondering if I was enough. Today, I would not give him that power. The judge shuffled some papers, her expression unreadable. "We are here to resolve the dissolution of your marriage and the division of assets. I expect both parties to behave with decorum." She paused, her eyes flicking between us. "Mr. Carter, you have made some serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support your claims?" He hesitated, glancing at his lawyer, who quickly produced a stack of documents. "She's been hiding money," my husband said, his voice lower now, but no less venomous. "She's been lying to me for years. I want what I'm owed." I felt the eyes of the room shift to me, waiting for my reaction. My attorney squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder that we were ready for this. We had anticipated every accusation, every desperate attempt to paint me as the villain. But still, the shame washed over me, hot and suffocating. The judge took the documents, scanning them with practiced efficiency. "We will review these in due course," she said. "But let me be clear. This court will not tolerate baseless accusations or emotional outbursts. We are here to ensure a fair and equitable resolution." My husband slumped back in his chair, his anger momentarily spent. I could see the cracks in his armor, the fear behind the bluster. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. The proceedings continued, each word, each legal term feeling like a blow. My life was being dissected, my choices scrutinized, my worth measured in dollars and cents. I tried to focus on the facts, to remember that I was more than the sum of my mistakes. But it was hard, so hard, to keep my head above water when every wave threatened to pull me under. As the morning wore on, the judge's patience wore thin. She called for a brief recess, her eyes lingering on me as if to say, "Hold on, this isn't over." I stood, my legs unsteady, and made my way to the hallway, desperate for a moment of solitude. But even there, I couldn't escape the whispers, the sideways glances, the sense that my life was unraveling in front of an audience. I closed my eyes, willing myself to be strong, to remember why I was here. I had survived worse than this. I had secrets of my own, truths that would change everything if only I had the courage to reveal them. When we returned to the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The judge cleared her throat, her gaze sweeping the room. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even my husband, "there is a matter of significant importance that must be addressed." Every head turned. My husband straightened in his seat, his bravado returning. I felt my heart leap into my throat. The judge's eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew everything was about to change. If you'd asked anyone in our circle, they would have said we were the perfect couple. Our wedding photos still hung in my mother's living room, all white lace and beaming smiles, the kind of images that made strangers believe in fairy tales. I remember the way my husband, Daniel, would wrap his arm around my waist at parties, pulling me close as if to say, "She's mine." Friends envied us, and even my own family would sometimes look at me with a mixture of pride and awe, as if I'd won some secret lottery. In those early years, I believed it too. I believed in the story we told the world, the one where love conquers all and hard work is always rewarded. I gave up my job at the art gallery to support Daniel's career, telling myself it was just for a little while, just until he got that next promotion. I learned to cook his favorite meals, to laugh at his jokes even when I'd heard them 100 times, to smooth over his rough edges when he was tired or irritable. I became the woman he wanted me to be, and for a while I convinced myself that was enough. Our home was always immaculate, the kind of place that looked ready for a magazine shoot at any moment. I took pride in the details, the fresh flowers on the table, the perfectly fluffed pillows, the way sunlight streamed through the kitchen window in the mornings. Daniel liked things a certain way, and I made sure to deliver. He'd smile and say, "No one keeps a house like you do, Anna." I'd glow with pride, even as a small voice inside me wondered when I'd last painted, or read a book just for myself. We hosted dinner parties that people talked about for weeks. Daniel would pour wine and tell stories about his work, his voice filling the room, while I floated in the background, refilling glasses and making sure everyone had enough to eat. He was charming, attentive, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and always brought a gift. I watched him work a room and felt lucky, even as I noticed how he never quite let me finish a story, how he'd gently steer the conversation back to himself. Looking back, I see the cracks that were always there, hairline fractures beneath the glossy surface. The first time I noticed was at a friend's wedding, when I laughed a little too loudly at an old college friend's joke. Daniel's hand tightened on my arm, just for a second, his smile never faltering. Later, in the car, he said, "You don't want people to think you're flirting, do you?" I brushed it off, told myself he was just protective, that it was sweet he cared so much. But the comments kept coming, small and sharp as splinters. "That dress is a little much, don't you think? Maybe you should skip dessert tonight. You know, you're lucky I'm so patient." Each one landed softly, almost lovingly, but over time, they built a cage I didn't even realize I was living in. I stopped wearing my favorite red lipstick. I started double-checking my outfits before leaving the house. I learned to anticipate his moods, to avoid topics that might set him off. My ambitions faded into the background, replaced by Daniel's dreams. I told myself I was being supportive, that this was what marriage was: compromise, sacrifice, partnership. But sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake and remember the girl I used to be. The one who wanted to open her own gallery, who painted until her fingers ached, who believed she could be anything. I missed her, but I didn't know how to find her again. Our public life was a performance, and I played my part well. At family gatherings, I'd smile and say, "We're doing great, thank you," even when Daniel hadn't spoken to me all morning. At work events, I'd laugh at his jokes and nod along as he talked about our future, even when I wasn't sure what that future looked like anymore. I became an expert at hiding my doubts, at smoothing over the rough patches, at pretending everything was fine. But the cracks kept widening. There was the time Daniel accidentally deleted a folder of my digital paintings, saying he thought it was just clutter on the computer. Or the way he'd dismiss my ideas for vacations, insisting his work schedule was too demanding, that we'd go someday. I started to feel invisible, like a shadow in my own life. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me, her eyes tired, her smile forced. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly happy, truly seen. The silence in the house felt heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. That night, as I lay in bed beside Daniel, listening to his steady breathing, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Was this really the life I wanted? Was this the man I'd promised forever to? I pushed the questions away, telling myself every marriage had its ups and downs, that I just needed to try harder, to be better. But the next morning, as I was making coffee, I noticed Daniel's phone buzzing on the counter. A message flashed across the screen, just a name I didn't recognize, and a string of hearts. My hand trembled as I set his mug down, my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to ask. If only I'd seen the signs sooner. If only I'd listened to that small, persistent voice inside me. But I didn't. I smoothed my hair, put on my best smile, and carried on with the day, pretending everything was perfect. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. The cracks were no longer invisible, and for the first time, I couldn't look away. At first, the changes were so subtle, I almost convinced myself they weren't happening. Daniel started coming home later, his excuses vague and his eyes tired. He'd drop his keys on the counter with a sigh, barely glancing in my direction. I'd ask about his day, and he'd grunt something non-committal, already scrolling through his phone. The warmth that once filled our home had cooled, replaced by a chill that crept into every corner, every conversation. I tried to ignore it, to believe it was just a rough patch, the kind every marriage goes through. I told myself he was stressed at work, that he needed space, that if I just tried a little harder, things would go back to the way they were. I cooked his favorite meals, left little notes in his briefcase, even bought new lingerie in a desperate attempt to spark anything between us. But my efforts were met with indifference, or worse, irritation. One evening, as I set the table for dinner, Daniel walked in, glanced at the candles I'd lit, and rolled his eyes. "What's all this for?" he asked, his tone flat. I forced a smile. I thought we could have a nice dinner together, just the two of us. He shrugged, loosening his tie. "I'm not hungry. I already ate." He disappeared into his office, closing the door behind him. I sat alone at the table, the food growing cold, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. The distance between us grew with each passing day. Conversations became transactional. Did you pay the bills? Did you pick up the dry cleaning? And even those were laced with impatience. When I tried to talk about how I was feeling, Daniel would sigh and say, "You're always so dramatic, Anna. Can't you just be happy for once?" His words stung, but I swallowed my hurt, afraid that if I pushed too hard, he'd pull away completely. It wasn't just Daniel who changed. Our friends seemed to sense the tension, their invitations growing less frequent. At gatherings, I'd catch them exchanging glances when Daniel snapped at me or made a cutting remark. I tried to laugh it off, to pretend everything was fine, but I could feel their judgment, their pity. My best friend Rachel pulled me aside one night after a particularly awkward dinner. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her eyes searching mine. I forced a smile, insisting I was just tired, but the truth was, I didn't know how to answer her. Family gatherings became minefields. My mother would ask, "Is everything all right between you and Daniel?" in that careful, measured way that told me she already knew the answer. Daniel, ever the charmer, would put on a show, holding my hand and telling stories that made everyone laugh. But as soon as we were alone, the mask would slip. He'd criticize the way I spoke, the way I dressed, the way I breathed. "You're embarrassing yourself," he'd say, his voice low and cold. "Why can't you just be normal?" I started to doubt myself, to question my own reality. Was I really as difficult as he said? Was I overreacting, too sensitive, too needy? Daniel was a master at twisting my words, making me feel like the villain in my own story. If I cried, he'd accuse me of trying to manipulate him. If I stayed silent, he'd accuse me of shutting him out. No matter what I did, it was never enough. The isolation was suffocating. I stopped reaching out to friends, afraid of what they might say, or worse, what they might see. I spent my days going through the motions, keeping the house spotless, making sure Daniel had everything he needed, all while feeling like a ghost in my own life. The woman I used to be, the one who laughed easily, who dreamed big, who believed in love, felt like a distant memory. Daniel's resentment grew more obvious. He'd make snide comments about my lack of ambition, my wasted potential. "You could have done something with your life, Anna," he'd say, shaking his head. "But I guess this is all you're good for." I wanted to scream, to tell him about the dreams I'd given up for him, the sacrifices I'd made. But I knew it wouldn't matter. He'd just twist my words, make me feel small. The gaslighting became relentless. He'd deny things he'd said, accuse me of imagining arguments, insist that I was the problem. "You need help," he'd say, his voice dripping with contempt. "Maybe you should see someone about your issues." I started to wonder if he was right. Maybe I was losing my mind. One night, after another argument that left me in tears, I called Rachel. I tried to explain what was happening, but the words caught in my throat. "I just feel so alone," I whispered. She listened, her voice gentle and steady. "You're not alone, Anna. I'm here. Whatever you need." Her kindness made me cry harder, the dam finally breaking. For the first time, I admitted to myself that things were not okay, that I was not okay. But even with Rachel's support, the walls kept closing in. Daniel became more distant, more cruel. He stopped coming home some nights, offering no explanation. When I confronted him, he laughed. "You're paranoid. Maybe if you weren't so boring, I'd want to be here." His words cut deeper than any knife. The final blow came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was folding laundry when I heard the doorbell ring. I opened the door to find a courier standing on the porch, a thick envelope in his hand. "For Mrs. Anna Carter," he said, offering a sympathetic smile. My hands shook as I took the envelope, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew, even before I opened it, what it was. Divorce papers. The words stared up at me, cold and final. Daniel's signature at the bottom, neat and unfeeling. I sank to the floor, the weight of it all crashing down on me. I thought things couldn't get worse until they did. And as I sat there, clutching the papers, I realized my life was about to change forever. I always thought betrayal would come with warning signs, late-night phone calls, lipstick on a collar, a sudden change in routine. But when the truth finally surfaced, it was so much colder, so much more calculated than I could have ever imagined. It didn't come in a dramatic confession or a tearful apology. It came in the form of a bank statement, a single sheet of paper that shattered the last fragile pieces of trust I had left. It started with a phone call from the bank. I was in the kitchen staring out the window at the gray November sky when my phone buzzed. The woman on the other end was polite, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Carter, we just wanted to confirm a recent transfer from your joint account. It was a significant amount, and we always like to double-check with our clients." My heart skipped. "What transfer?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She read out the amount more than I'd ever seen leave our account at once, and the date. 2 days ago. I thanked her, hung up, and felt the world tilt beneath my feet. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Daniel was moving money for a new investment, or paying off a debt he'd forgotten to mention. But as I scrolled through our online banking, my hands shaking, I saw a pattern I couldn't ignore. Transfers, withdrawals, credit card charges I didn't recognize. Thousands of dollars gone. My mind raced, trying to piece together the story behind the numbers. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. Daniel had been siphoning money for months, maybe longer. I confronted him that night, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "Daniel, what's going on with our accounts? Where is all this money going?" He didn't even look up from his phone. Don't worry about it, he said, his tone dismissive. It's just some investments. I've got it under control. But I pressed, refusing to be brushed aside. I have a right to know. This is our money. He finally looked at me, his eyes cold. You wouldn't understand. Just stay out of it, Anna. That was the moment I realized how little I knew about the man I'd married. The man who once promised to protect me, to build a life together, was now hiding things from me, big things. I felt a wave of nausea, a sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath me had given way. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, but deep down I knew better. The next day I started digging. I went through old emails, bank statements, anything I could find. The more I uncovered, the more my stomach twisted. There were secret accounts, credit cards in his name only, payments to people I'd never heard of. I found receipts for expensive dinners, hotel stays, gifts none of which were for me. My hands shook as I pieced it all together, the evidence forming a picture I didn't want to see. It was Rachel who finally said what I was too afraid to admit. We were sitting in her living room, the evidence spread out on the coffee table between us. Anna, I think he's having an affair, she said gently. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to argue, to insist there had to be another explanation, but the truth was right there, in black and white. I remembered the late nights, the sudden business trips, the way he'd started guarding his phone like a secret. The way he'd pull away when I tried to touch him, the coldness in his eyes when he looked at me. It all made sense now, in the worst possible way. I felt a strange sense of calm as I absorbed the truth. The pain was sharp, but it was also clarifying. For so long I'd been gaslit, made to feel crazy for questioning him, for doubting his loyalty. Now I had proof. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. He was the one who'd been lying. But the betrayal didn't stop at infidelity. The financial manipulation was just as devastating. I realized how vulnerable I was, how much I'd trusted him to handle our finances while I focused on keeping our home, supporting his career, and putting my own dreams on hold. I'd given up so much, believing we were building something together, only to find out he'd been building an escape route for himself. I spent sleepless nights replaying every conversation, every moment I'd ignored my instincts. I thought about the times he'd accused me of being paranoid, the way he'd laughed off my concerns. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to be the perfect wife, only to be left with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. The final confirmation came in the form of a text message. I was cleaning the living room when Daniel's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He was in the shower, and for once, he'd left it unattended. I hesitated, my heart pounding, then picked it up. The message was from a number I didn't recognize. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Kicks. My hands went numb. I scrolled through the thread, reading messages that left no room for doubt. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was in love with someone else. I sat down, the phone still in my hand, and let the reality wash over me. The man I'd built my life around had been living a double life, lying to my face while planning his future with someone else. I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the life I thought I had, relief that I finally knew the truth. But as the shock faded, something else took its place, a cold, clear resolve. I wasn't going to let him destroy me. I wasn't going to let him walk away with everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed. He thought he'd broken me, but he had no idea what I was hiding. I took a deep breath, wiped my tears, and started making a plan. I gathered every piece of evidence, every bank statement, every text message. I called a lawyer, determined to protect myself and what little I had left. I was done being the victim. I was done letting Daniel control the narrative. He had no idea what was coming. And as I looked at the stack of evidence in front of me, I realized I was ready to fight back. I sat at the kitchen table, the divorce papers spread out before me like a map of my failures. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall, each second a reminder of how much time I'd lost trying to save a marriage that was already gone. I felt hollow, as if Daniel had scooped out everything inside me and left only the shell. But as the numbness settled in, something else began to stir a memory, faint but insistent, like a light flickering in the dark. It was my grandmother's voice, warm and steady, echoing from years ago. Always keep something for yourself, Anna. The world can change in a heartbeat. I remembered the day she'd pressed a small, ornate key into my hand, her eyes serious. This is for your future, for when you need it most. At the time, I'd laughed, thinking she was being dramatic. But now, as I stared at the papers that would end my marriage, I realized she'd known something I hadn't. I rose from the table and went to the bedroom, opening the bottom drawer of my dresser. There, beneath a stack of old sweaters, was the small lockbox my grandmother had given me. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a folder of documents, bank statements, property deeds, and a letter written in her careful script. I read her words, feeling her presence wrap around me like a blanket. This is yours, Anna, no one else's. Use it wisely. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was a portfolio of investments, a small but thriving art gallery in my name, and a trust fund that had quietly grown over the years. I'd never told Daniel about any of it. At first, it was because I wanted something that was just mine, a piece of my old self I could hold on to. Later, as his temper grew and his words turned sharp, it became a lifeline, a secret I guarded fiercely, even as I let go of so much else. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Daniel thought he'd taken everything from me, my confidence, my security, my future, but he didn't know about this. He didn't know that I wasn't as powerless as I seemed. I spent the next few days in a haze of quiet determination. I made an appointment with a lawyer, choosing a woman recommended by Rachel, someone known for her discretion and tenacity. I gathered every document, every scrap of evidence I could find: bank statements, emails, receipts. I made copies of everything, storing them in a folder I kept with me at all times. I wasn't going to let Daniel blindside me again. The first meeting with my lawyer was both terrifying and empowering. I sat across from her in a sunlit office, my hands clenched in my lap. She listened as I told her everything about Daniel's manipulation, the hidden accounts, the inheritance I'd kept secret. She nodded, her expression calm but fierce. "You're smarter than you think, Anna. Most women don't have a safety net. You do. Let's use it." We talked strategy. She explained how to protect my assets, how to document Daniel's financial abuse, how to ensure the court saw the truth. For the first time, I felt like I had an ally, someone who believed in me, who saw my strength even when I couldn't. I left her office with a folder of instructions and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. At home, I moved through the days with a new sense of resolve. I was careful, never letting Daniel see the change in me. I played the part of the wounded wife, letting him believe he'd won. But inside, I was building something, gathering evidence, making plans, preparing for the fight ahead. I started visiting the art gallery more often, reconnecting with the manager and the artists who showed their work there. It felt good to be in a place that was mine, surrounded by color and creativity. I remembered the woman I used to be, the one who dreamed of owning a gallery, of making her mark on the world. That woman wasn't gone. She was just waiting for her moment. Daniel, oblivious to the storm gathering beneath the surface, continued his campaign of control. He gloated about his new life, made snide remarks about how I'd never survive on my own. I let him talk, nodding and smiling, all the while knowing something he didn't. I was no longer afraid. Each night, I reviewed my notes, double-checked my files, and rehearsed what I would say in court. I was meticulous, leaving nothing to chance. I knew Daniel would fight dirty, he always did, but this time, I was ready. The vulnerability I'd felt in those first days after the divorce papers arrived was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't weakness, it was fuel. Every hurtful word, every betrayal, every moment of doubt had forged something strong inside me. I was done being the victim. I was done letting Daniel write the story of my life. As I stood in front of the mirror one morning, I saw a new woman staring back at me. Her eyes were clear, her shoulders squared. She was scared, yes, but she was also determined. She knew what she was worth, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. He thought he'd taken everything from me. He had no idea what I was capable of. And as I closed the lockbox and tucked it away, I made a silent promise to myself. I would fight for what was mine. I would fight for myself. The next time I saw Daniel, I would be ready. And this time, the outcome would be different. The first time I walked into my lawyer's office after Daniel served the divorce papers, I felt like a child playing dress-up in someone else's life. The glass doors, the polished floors, the quiet hum of professionals moving with purpose, it was a world away from the chaos I'd left behind at home. But as I sat across from my attorney, I realized this was where the real battle would be fought. Not in our living room, not in whispered arguments behind closed doors, but here in the cold, bright light of the law. My lawyer, Julia, was everything I wasn't: confident, unflappable, and sharp as a blade. She listened as I laid out the facts, her pen moving quickly across the page. "He's going to come after everything," she said, not unkindly. "Men like Daniel always do, but you have more power than you think." Her words were a lifeline, and I clung to them as we began to map out our strategy. The first move came quickly. Daniel's lawyer sent a letter demanding full access to all our financial records, including the art gallery and any hidden assets. The implication was clear. He suspected I was hiding something, and he intended to find it. Julia smiled when she read the letter, her eyes glinting with amusement. "Let him look," she said. "We have nothing to hide and everything to gain." But Daniel didn't stop there. He filed motions to freeze our joint accounts, leaving me scrambling to cover basic expenses. He tried to have my car repossessed, claiming it was purchased with marital funds. He even called my gallery, demanding to see the books, threatening the staff with lawsuits if they didn't comply. Each move was calculated to rattle me, to make me feel small and powerless. I won't pretend it didn't work, at least at first. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. What if he really could take everything? What if I ended up with nothing, just as he'd always threatened? But every time the fear threatened to swallow me, I remembered my grandmother's words, the key in my hand, the quiet strength I'd found in myself. I wasn't alone. I had Julia. I had my own mind, my own resources, and I had the truth. The legal battle became a game of chess, each side maneuvering for advantage. Daniel's lawyer was ruthless, filing motion after motion, demanding documents, depositions, and endless meetings. Julia matched him move for move, her responses crisp and unyielding. She taught me how to answer questions without giving away too much, how to keep my emotions in check when Daniel tried to provoke me. The depositions were the worst. Daniel sat across from me, his eyes cold and triumphant, as his lawyer peppered me with questions about my spending, my friendships, even my mental health. "Isn't it true you've been seeing a therapist?" he asked, his tone dripping with insinuation. I met his gaze, refusing to flinch. Yes, I needed help dealing with the stress of this divorce. Julia squeezed my hand under the table, a silent show of support. Daniel's testimony was a performance worthy of an Oscar. He painted himself as the wronged husband, the victim of my supposed deceit. He told stories about my erratic behavior, my secretive nature, my unwillingness to contribute to the marriage. He even brought up the time I'd forgotten our anniversary, spinning it into a tale of emotional neglect. I listened in disbelief, marveling at his ability to twist the truth until it was unrecognizable. But Julia was ready. She countered every accusation with evidence, emails, receipts, witness statements. She exposed Daniel's financial manipulations, his attempts to hide assets, his pattern of emotional abuse. The more she revealed, the more Daniel's mask began to slip. He grew agitated, snapping at his lawyer, glaring at me across the table. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Outside the courtroom, Daniel's aggression escalated. He sent me threatening texts, warning me that I'd regret this if I didn't back down. He called my friends, trying to turn them against me, spreading rumors about my supposed instability. Some believed him. Others saw through the act and rallied around me, offering support and encouragement. The lines were drawn, and I knew there was no going back. The emotional toll was immense. There were days I felt like I was drowning, pulled under by the weight of it all. But there were also moments of clarity, flashes of the woman I used to be, the woman I was becoming again. I started to see the divorce not as an ending, but as a beginning, a chance to reclaim my life, to build something new from the ashes of what Daniel had tried to destroy. The court hearings were grueling. Each side presented their case, the air thick with tension and barely concealed animosity. Daniel's lawyer argued that I was hiding assets, that I was unfit to manage our finances, that I deserved nothing. Julia countered with calm precision, laying out the facts, exposing Daniel's lies. The judge listened, her expression unreadable as the battle played out before her. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal hearing, Julia pulled me aside. "He's getting desperate," she said quietly. "He knows he's losing control. That's when men like him are most dangerous." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but they also steeled my resolve. I wouldn't let Daniel intimidate me. Not anymore. As the weeks passed, the case grew more complex. New evidence surfaced: emails between Daniel and his mistress, bank transfers to secret accounts, recordings of his threats. Each revelation chipped away at his facade, revealing the man beneath, petty, vindictive, and afraid. I watched as his confidence faltered, his arrogance giving way to panic. Through it all, I kept my focus. I followed Julia's advice, documented everything, and refused to engage with Daniel's provocations. I poured my energy into the gallery, finding solace in the art and the people who believed in me. I leaned on Rachel and the few friends who had stayed by my side, drawing strength from their unwavering support. The final pretrial conference was a turning point. Daniel arrived late, disheveled and angry, his lawyer struggling to keep him calm. Julia presented our case with quiet authority, laying out the evidence with surgical precision. The judge listened, her eyes sharp, her questions pointed. When the session ended, she set a date for the final hearing, a day that would decide everything. As I left the courthouse, the weight of the past months pressed down on me. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a sense of anticipation, of possibility. The end was in sight, and for the first time I believed I could win. He had no idea what was coming next. The real game was about to begin. In the weeks leading up to the final court date, I learned that divorce wasn't just a legal battle, it was a test of every relationship I'd ever built. The world seemed to split into two camps: those who stood by me and those who quietly, or not so quietly, drifted to Daniel's side. The lines were never as clear as I wanted them to be. Sometimes the people I thought would be my fiercest defenders faded away, while others I'd barely noticed before stepped forward with unexpected kindness. Rachel was my anchor. She called every morning, sometimes just to say good luck, sometimes to listen as I vented my fears. She brought over groceries when I was too anxious to leave the house, and she never once asked me to justify my choices. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone," she told me, her voice fierce. "You're doing what you have to do." Her loyalty was a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I sometimes felt. But not everyone was so steadfast. My cousin Emily, who had always been quick to offer advice and opinions, suddenly stopped returning my calls. I heard through the grapevine that she'd been having lunch with Daniel, listening to his side of the story. It stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd always thought of Emily as a sister, someone who would have my back no matter what. Now her silence felt like a betrayal. The gossip spread quickly. At the grocery store, I caught snippets of conversation, my name, Daniel's name, words like messy and scandal. Some people looked at me with pity, others with thinly veiled judgment. I tried to hold my head high, but the whispers followed me everywhere. Even at the art gallery, a place that had always felt like a sanctuary, I sensed the shift. A few artists pulled away, worried about the fallout. Others, like Maria, the gallery's manager, became even more protective. "Let them talk," she said, squeezing my hand. "You know who you are. My mother was a wild card." She called often, her voice tight with worry. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" she'd ask, as if I had any other choice. She meant well, but her questions chipped away at my confidence. I could hear the fear in her voice, the fear that I'd end up alone, that I'd made a mistake I couldn't undo. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her I was stronger than she thought. But some days I wasn't sure I believed it myself. One afternoon, as I was sorting through paperwork at the gallery, a woman I barely knew approached me. Her name was Linda, and she'd been a client of Daniel's firm years ago. She leaned in, her voice low. "I just wanted to say, I know what you're going through. Daniel isn't who he pretends to be. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Her words caught me off guard. I thanked her, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I wasn't as isolated as I thought. But the betrayals kept coming. I found out that one of my closest friends had been feeding information to Daniel, details about my finances, my plans, even my emotional state. When I confronted her, she shrugged. He just wanted to know how you were doing. I didn't think it was a big deal. Her casual dismissal hurt more than any of Daniel's accusations. I realized then that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken and almost impossible to repair. Despite the setbacks, I refused to back down. Every betrayal, every whispered rumor only strengthened my resolve. I poured my energy into preparing for court, working closely with my lawyer and gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I kept a journal, documenting every interaction with Daniel, every threat, every attempt to undermine me. I was determined to be ready for whatever he threw my way. Rachel continued to be my rock, but I also found support in unexpected places. Maria offered to testify on my behalf, sharing stories of Daniel's attempts to interfere with the gallery. Linda connected me with a support group for women going through high-conflict divorces. Their stories were different, but the pain was the same. We shared advice, encouragement, and most importantly, the knowledge that we weren't alone. Still, the doubts crept in late at night when the house was quiet and the future felt uncertain. I wondered if I was strong enough, if I could really stand up to Daniel and the army of people he'd convinced to take his side. I worried about the toll it was taking on my health, my friendships, my sense of self. But every morning, I got up, put on my bravest face, and kept moving forward. Then, one evening, as I was reviewing documents in my living room, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text was short, but it made my heart race. Check the file labeled Summer 2019 in Daniel's office. You'll find what you need. I stared at the screen, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a trap, or was it the break I'd been waiting for? I didn't know who had sent the message, or why they wanted to help me. But as I read it again, I felt a surge of determination. Maybe I wouldn't have to stand alone in court after all. Maybe, just maybe, I had more allies than I realized. And as I prepared to follow the mysterious clue, I knew one thing for certain. I was not giving up. Not now. Not ever. The courthouse felt colder than I remembered, the air thick with anticipation and the low hum of whispered conversations. I walked through the heavy doors, my heels echoing on the polished floor, every step a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I still had to lose. Rachel squeezed my hand before I entered the courtroom, her eyes fierce with encouragement. "You've got this, Anna," she whispered. I nodded, drawing strength from her faith in me, and pushed open the door. Inside, the room was already buzzing. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer beside him, both of them exuding smug confidence. Daniel's suit was immaculate, his hair perfectly styled, but there was a tightness around his mouth I hadn't seen before. He didn't look at me as I took my seat, but I could feel his gaze burning holes in my resolve. I straightened my shoulders, refusing to let him see even a flicker of doubt. My lawyer, Julia, was a force of nature. She greeted me with a reassuring nod, her presence calm and unyielding. "Remember, Anna," she murmured, "the truth is on our side. Just breathe." I clung to her words as the judge entered, her gavel striking the bench with a sharp crack that silenced the room. The proceedings began with Daniel's lawyer, who wasted no time painting me as the villain. He spoke of my supposed emotional instability, my secretive behavior, and my unwillingness to cooperate. He presented emails, taken out of context, and called witnesses who parroted Daniel's narrative. I listened in silence, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my heart pounding with every accusation. Daniel took the stand, his performance flawless. He spoke of our marriage in glowing terms, then described my sudden change and irrational decisions. He looked at the judge with practiced sincerity, his voice trembling as he described the pain I'd caused him. I watched, equal parts furious and fascinated, as he spun a web of half-truths and outright lies. For a moment, I wondered if anyone would see through it, but Julia was ready. When it was our turn, she rose with quiet authority, her questions sharp and precise. She dismantled Daniel's story piece by piece, exposing inconsistencies and highlighting the gaps in his testimony. She called Maria, who described Daniel's attempts to interfere with the gallery, and Linda, who spoke of his reputation for manipulation. Each witness chipped away at the facade Daniel had so carefully constructed. When I took the stand, I felt the weight of every eye in the room. Julia guided me gently, her questions allowing me to tell my story in my own words. I spoke of the early days of our marriage, the slow erosion of trust, the gaslighting and isolation. I described the fear, the loneliness, and the moment I realized I had to fight for myself. My voice shook at times, but I refused to look away from the judge. I wanted her to see the truth in my eyes. Daniel's lawyer tried to rattle me, firing off questions meant to trip me up. "Isn't it true you hid assets from your husband?" he demanded. I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I protected what was mine," I replied. After years of being told I was nothing, I held on to the one thing that was truly mine. The room was silent for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Daniel grew more agitated as the day wore on, his confidence slipping with every piece of evidence Julia presented. He whispered furiously to his lawyer, his face flushed with anger. I watched him unravel, the mask slipping to reveal the man I'd come to know all too well. The judge listened intently, her expression unreadable. She asked pointed questions, pressing both sides for clarity. At one point, she paused, her gaze lingering on Daniel. "Mr. Carter, can you explain these discrepancies in your financial records?" Daniel stammered, his answers growing more evasive. Julia seized the opportunity, presenting documentation of his hidden accounts and questionable transfers. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, the courtroom grew heavy with expectation. Both sides had laid their cards on the table, and the outcome hung in the balance. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, a quiet certainty that I had done everything I could. Whatever happened next, I would face it with my head held high. The judge cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension. "Before I make my ruling, I have a few more questions regarding the division of assets." She looked directly at me, her eyes sharp and searching. "Mrs. Carter, can you account for all assets in your name, including any inheritances, trusts, or business holdings?" A hush fell over the room. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. This was it, the moment everything would change. I glanced at Julia, who gave me a small, encouraging nod. I turned back to the judge, my voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I can account for every asset in my name." The words felt like a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Daniel's lawyer scrambled to object, but the judge held up a hand. "We will review all documentation before proceeding." She looked at Daniel, her gaze cool and unyielding. "Mr. Carter, you will have the opportunity to respond, but I expect full transparency from both parties." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the judge called for a brief recess. I stood, my legs trembling, and made my way to the hallway. Rachel was waiting, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Anna," she whispered, pulling me into a tight embrace. I clung to her, the adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. But even as I allowed myself a moment of relief, I knew the battle wasn't over. The judge had yet to make her ruling, and Daniel would fight to the bitter end. Still, for the first time, I felt the balance of power shift. I was no longer the woman cowering in the shadows. I was standing in the light, unafraid. As we returned to the courtroom, the judge's voice rang out, commanding attention. "We will now address the matter of assets and their distribution." The words sent a ripple through the room, every eye fixed on me. The judge was about to drop a bombshell, and I was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Every eye was on the judge as she sifted through the thick stack of documents Julia and I had provided. Daniel sat rigid beside his lawyer, his jaw clenched, fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the table. The confidence he'd worn like armor all morning had begun to crack, and I could see the first glimmers of uncertainty in his eyes. The judge cleared her throat, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on me. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for your thorough documentation. The court has reviewed the records of your inheritance, the trust established by your grandmother, and the business interests in your name." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. It is clear that these assets were never commingled with marital property and have been maintained separately throughout the duration of your marriage." A ripple of whispers swept through the gallery. Daniel's lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously in his ear, but Daniel barely seemed to hear him. His face had gone pale, his eyes darting between me and the judge as if searching for some hidden escape. The judge continued, her tone measured but firm. "The court recognizes the validity of Mrs. Carter's inheritance and business holdings as her sole and separate property. These assets are not subject to division in this proceeding." She looked directly at Daniel, her expression unyielding. "Mr. Carter, your claims to these assets are without merit." For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then, as the reality of the judge's words sank in, the tension broke like a dam. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the gallery. Even the bailiff looked momentarily stunned. I felt the air rush from my lungs, a dizzying mix of relief and vindication flooding through me. I glanced at Julia, who gave me a small, triumphant smile. Daniel, on the other hand, looked as if he'd been struck. The color drained from his face, and his mouth opened and closed, searching for words that wouldn't come. His lawyer tried to regain control, standing to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "The evidence is clear. The court will not entertain further argument on this matter." I watched as Daniel's bravado melted away, replaced by something raw and desperate. He turned to me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Anna, you never told me about any of this," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no anger now, only fear, a man realizing too late that the ground beneath him had vanished. I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "You never asked," I replied quietly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every secret I'd kept, every moment I'd spent doubting myself. For years, I'd let him believe he held all the power. Now, in front of everyone, the truth was undeniable. The judge moved on, addressing the remaining marital assets, what little was left after Daniel's reckless spending and secret withdrawals. She outlined the division with clinical precision, awarding me the home and a fair share of the joint savings. Daniel's attempts to hide money had backfired spectacularly. The court ordered him to repay what he'd siphoned away, with interest. As the judge spoke, Daniel's composure unraveled. He shifted in his seat, his hands trembling. Gone was the man who had strutted into court certain of victory. In his place was someone small, cornered, and utterly lost. He leaned toward his lawyer, voice rising in panic. "Do something. This can't be happening. She can't just walk away with everything." His lawyer tried to calm him, but Daniel was beyond reason. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, this isn't fair. She lied to me. She hid things from me for years." His voice cracked, echoing off the courtroom walls. The judge's expression hardened. "Mr. Carter, sit down," she commanded. "You have had ample opportunity to present your case. The evidence speaks for itself. This court will not tolerate further outbursts." Daniel slumped back into his seat, defeated. The gallery watched in stunned silence as the man who had once seemed so invincible was reduced to pleading and bluster. I felt a strange sense of pity for him, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger, a fierce pride in myself for having survived, for having protected what was mine. Julia leaned over, her voice low and steady. "You did it, Anna. He can't touch you now." I nodded, barely able to believe it was real. For so long, I'd lived in fear of what Daniel might do if he ever found out about the inheritance. Now, the secret that had once felt like a burden had become my salvation. The judge concluded her remarks, setting a date for the final signing of the decree. "This matter is settled," she said, her gavel coming down with a decisive thud. "Court is adjourned." As people began to file out, Daniel remained frozen in his seat, staring at the table in front of him. I gathered my things, my hands steady for the first time in months. Rachel met me at the door, her eyes shining with pride and relief. "You were incredible," she whispered, pulling me into a tight embrace. But even as I allowed myself a moment of victory, I could feel Daniel's eyes on me, burning with a mixture of regret and rage. He realized too late what he'd lost, not just the money, but the woman he'd underestimated for so long. I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high, knowing that the power had finally shifted. Behind me, Daniel's frantic voice echoed down the hallway, demanding answers, searching for someone to blame. But I didn't look back. I was done living in his shadow. The future was mine now, and for the first time, I was ready to claim it. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavy and every second stretch. Daniel's face, once so smug and certain, was now a mask of disbelief and desperation. The judge's words about my inheritance and the evidence of his financial deceit had landed like a thunderclap, shattering the illusion of control he'd clung to for so long. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the table, as if hoping the wood grain would offer him a way out. But then, as the reality of his situation settled in, Daniel's demeanor shifted. The arrogance drained from his posture, replaced by a frantic, almost pleading energy. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously, but the man only shook his head, defeated. Daniel's eyes darted to me, searching for a lifeline, a crack in my resolve. He found none. When the judge called for closing statements, Daniel's lawyer stood, his voice subdued. "Your Honor, my client wishes to address the court directly." The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. Daniel rose, straightening his tie with trembling hands. He looked at me, his eyes wide and unsteady, and for the first time in years, I saw fear there. "Anna," he began, his voice cracking, "I know things have been difficult. I know I made mistakes, but we built a life together. Doesn't that count for something?" He glanced at the judge, then back at me, his tone growing more desperate. "I'm willing to work things out. We can start over. I just need a chance." The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on us. I felt the weight of his words, the years of manipulation and gaslighting wrapped up in a single, desperate plea. For a moment, I remembered the man I'd married, the laughter, the promises, the dreams we'd once shared. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who would rather destroy me than admit his own failings. I stood, my voice steady and clear. "Daniel, you didn't want to work things out. You wanted to win. You lied, you cheated, and you tried to take everything from me. Now that you've lost, you want to pretend none of it happened. But I remember every word, every threat, every time you made me feel small. I'm done letting you control my life." He flinched, the truth hitting him harder than any accusation. "Anna, please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can fix this. I'll do anything." I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. "You can't fix what you broke, Daniel. Not with apologies, not with empty promises, and certainly not with threats. This is the end." Julia rose beside me, her presence a silent show of support. She addressed the judge, her words crisp and unwavering. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. My client's assets were never commingled with marital property. Mr. Carter's attempts to conceal funds and manipulate the court have been thoroughly documented. We ask that the court rule in favor of my client and grant her the full protection of her inheritance and business interests." The judge nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. "I have reviewed all the evidence and testimony. It is clear that Mrs. Carter's assets are her sole and separate property. Mr. Carter's actions have not only violated the trust of this marriage, but have also attempted to undermine the integrity of these proceedings." Daniel's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the truth finally laid bare. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but Daniel shook him off, his eyes fixed on the floor. The judge continued, her voice resolute. "This court rules in favor of Mrs. Carter. All assets in her name, including her inheritance, trust, and business holdings, remain her sole property. Mr. Carter is ordered to repay the funds he withdrew from joint accounts with interest. The marital home will be awarded to Mrs. Carter, and Mr. Carter will vacate the premises within 30 days. A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. I felt Rachel's hand squeeze my shoulder from behind, a silent celebration of justice finally served. Daniel looked up at me one last time, his eyes hollow. There was no more anger, no more bravado, just the stunned realization that he had lost everything he'd tried to steal. As the judge prepared to adjourn, she looked at me with a rare softness. "Mrs. Carter, you have shown remarkable strength and integrity. I hope you find peace and happiness as you move forward." I nodded, emotion swelling in my chest. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. The chains Daniel had wrapped around my life had been broken, not by anger or revenge, but by truth and resolve. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of the proceedings, I allowed myself a small, victorious smile. I had stood my ground. I had exposed his lies, and as I gathered my things, I knew that closure was finally within reach. The future was mine to claim, and I was ready to begin again. The judge's gavel struck the bench, the sound echoing through the hushed courtroom like a final, resounding heartbeat. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, every muscle in my body tense with anticipation. Daniel's eyes darted between me and the judge, his bravado from earlier in the day now replaced by a pale, anxious silence. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the verdict that would decide the fate of everything we had built and everything he had tried to take. The judge's voice was calm, but there was a gravity to her words that made each syllable feel monumental. After careful review of the evidence, testimony, and financial records, this court finds in favor of Mrs. Carter. She paused, letting the words settle over the room. The assets in question, including the inheritance, trust, and business holdings, are confirmed as her sole and separate property. Mr. Carter's claims to these assets are denied. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. I felt the tension in my chest release, replaced by a wave of disbelief and relief so powerful I nearly forgot to breathe. Julia squeezed my hand under the table, her eyes shining with pride. I looked at Daniel, expecting anger, but what I saw was something far more devastating: defeat. His shoulders slumped, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that would not come. The judge continued, her tone unwavering. Furthermore, the court finds that Mr. Carter's attempts to conceal assets and mislead the court constitute a violation of legal and ethical standards. He is ordered to repay the funds withdrawn from joint accounts with interest and to vacate the marital home within 30 days. Any further attempts to interfere with Mrs. Carter's business or personal affairs will result in additional legal consequences. Daniel's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. This matter is settled. The court expects both parties to comply fully with its orders. She turned to me, her expression softening just a fraction. Mrs. Carter, you are free to move forward with your life. I wish you peace and healing. The words washed over me, bittersweet and surreal. For so long I had dreamed of this moment of being free from Daniel's control, of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. But now that it was here, I felt a strange emptiness, as if I had been holding my breath for so long I had forgotten how to exhale. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of movement. Reporters whispered into their phones. Friends and strangers alike offered me sympathetic glances, and Rachel rushed to my side, her arms wrapping around me in a fierce hug. "You did it, Anna," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you," I whispered back, my voice trembling. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was going to be okay. Daniel remained seated, staring at the table as if he could will the outcome to change. His lawyer packed up their files in silence, avoiding my gaze. I felt a pang of pity for the man I had once loved, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of justice. He had made his choices. He had tried to destroy me, and in the end, he had only destroyed himself. As I gathered my things, Julia leaned in, her voice low and steady. "This is your victory, Anna. Don't let anyone take it from you." I nodded, her words settling deep in my heart. I had fought for myself, for my future, and I had won. The walk out of the courtroom felt like stepping into a new world. The air was crisp, the sky impossibly blue. Rachel walked beside me, her arm linked through mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of Daniel's shadow lift from my shoulders. I was free to rebuild, to rediscover who I was, to create a life on my own terms. But as we reached the steps outside, a wave of uncertainty washed over me. The battle was over, but the war had left scars. Could I really start over after everything I'd lost? Could I find happiness again? Or would the wounds of the past always haunt me? I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the world beyond. The future was a blank page, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I took a deep breath, feeling the sun on my face, and allowed myself a small, hopeful smile. I was free. And though I didn't know what came next, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone take my power again. The first morning after the verdict, I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window, the house eerily quiet. For a moment, I lay still, listening for the familiar sounds of Daniel's routine, the clatter of his keys, the low hum of his voice on the phone, but there was only silence. It was a strange, almost unsettling peace, and I wasn't sure whether to savor it or fear it. I pulled the covers tighter around me, letting the reality settle in. I was alone, truly alone. For the first time in years, the days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls and awkward conversations. I changed the locks on the house, updated my name on the mailbox, and met with Julia to finalize the last of the legal details. Each task felt like a small act of reclamation, a way to remind myself that this life was mine now, no longer subject to Daniel's whims or demands. Still, the emptiness lingered, a quiet ache that surfaced in the quiet moments between distractions. Rachel was a constant presence, her support unwavering. She brought over takeout and bottles of wine, filling the house with laughter and warmth. "You need to celebrate," she insisted one night, raising her glass in a toast. To freedom, to new beginnings, to Anna. I smiled, clinking my glass against hers, but inside, I wondered if I would ever truly feel whole again. Rebuilding my relationships was harder than I expected. Some friends, like Rachel and Maria, stood by me without question. Others drifted away, uncomfortable with the messiness of my new reality. My mother called often, her voice a mixture of relief and worry. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," she said one evening, "but I just want you to be happy." I assured her I was fine, even when I wasn't sure it was true. I threw myself into the art gallery, spending long hours surrounded by color and creativity. The work was grounding, a reminder of the dreams I'd once had before marriage and heartbreak had taken center stage. I reconnected with old artists, curated new shows, and even started painting again, tentative strokes at first, then bolder, more confident lines as the weeks passed. Each canvas felt like a piece of myself reclaimed, a silent declaration that I was still here, still capable of beauty and creation. But there were moments of doubt, 2 nights when the loneliness pressed in, when I questioned every decision that had led me here. I wondered if I'd made a mistake, if I'd traded one kind of pain for another. I missed the comfort of routine, the illusion of security, even the arguments that had once defined my days. The silence was both a gift and a curse, offering space to heal, but also room for old fears to creep in. One afternoon, as I was closing up the gallery, Maria stopped by with coffee and a stack of flyers. "There's a community art fair next month," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "You should enter. Show your work." I hesitated, the old insecurities rising to the surface. "I haven't shown anything in years," I admitted. Maria smiled, squeezing my hand. "That's exactly why you should. You're not the same person you were before, Anna. Let people see who you are now." Her words lingered with me as I walked home, the city alive with the sounds of spring. I thought about the woman I was becoming, the one who had survived betrayal, who had stood her ground in court, who was learning to trust herself again. Maybe happiness wasn't something that happened all at once. Maybe it was something you built, piece by piece, day by day. That night, I sat at my easel, the blank canvas glowing in the lamplight. I dipped my brush in paint, letting the colors flow without overthinking. With each stroke, I felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by a quiet sense of possibility. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, I was willing to find out. A few days later, as I was hanging a new exhibit at the gallery, a woman approached me. She introduced herself as Claire, a local business owner looking for artists to feature in her new cafe. "I've heard wonderful things about your work," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "Would you be interested in collaborating?" My heart skipped, excitement and nerves mingling in my chest. I agreed, feeling a spark of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. As I watched Claire walk away, I realized that life after heartbreak wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something new from the pieces left behind. I still had doubts, still had scars, but I was learning to trust in my own resilience. Was happiness still possible for me? I didn't know. But as I looked around at the gallery, at the art, at the friends who had become my family, I knew I was ready to find out. And with that new opportunity on the horizon, I stepped forward. One brushstroke, one day, one hope at a time. The first time I unlocked the gallery after the dust of the divorce had settled, I felt like I was stepping into a new world. The familiar scent of paint and wood polish greeted me, but everything looked different, brighter somehow, as if the sunlight itself had changed. I ran my fingers along the edge of the front desk, remembering the days I'd come here just to escape, to breathe, to remind myself that I still existed outside of Daniel's shadow. Now this place was more than a refuge. It was a beginning. I threw myself into the work, curating new shows, reaching out to artists I'd admired from afar, and even hanging my own paintings on the walls for the first time in years. The fear of judgment that had once paralyzed me was gone, replaced by a quiet pride. People came, drawn by the energy of the space, and I found myself at the center of a community I'd never realized I was building. Maria, ever loyal, became my right hand, and together we transformed the gallery into a place where stories, my story, and so many others could be told. Outside of work, I began to rebuild my friendships, reaching out to those I'd lost touch with during the long, isolating years of my marriage. Some relationships were easy to rekindle, laughter and memories flowing as if no time had passed. Others took more work, awkward apologies, and honest conversations about the ways I'd pulled away. But with each connection, I felt a piece of myself return, stronger and more whole than before. Rachel, of course, remained my constant. She dragged me to yoga classes, insisted on girls' nights, and never let me wallow for long. "You're not allowed to disappear again," she teased one evening as we sipped wine on my porch. "We need you here, Anna, the real you." I smiled, realizing she was right. For the first time, I wanted to be present not just for others, but for myself. It was during one of those evenings at the gallery, after a particularly successful opening, that I met Mark. He was quiet, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and he lingered by one of my paintings longer than anyone else. We struck up a conversation about art, about life, about the courage it takes to start over. There was no spark of instant romance, no whirlwind of passion, just a slow, steady warmth that grew with each encounter. He asked about my story, and I found myself telling him the truth, unvarnished and unashamed. He listened, really listened, and in his presence, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. As the weeks passed, Mark became a regular part of my life. We shared coffee in the mornings, long walks in the park, and quiet evenings filled with laughter and conversation. He never pushed, never demanded more than I was ready to give. Instead, he offered companionship, understanding, and the gentle reminder that love could be kind, not just consuming. But even as I embraced these new beginnings, the past lingered at the edges of my mind. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I wondered if I deserved this happiness, if I was truly free from Daniel's influence. The old fears resurfaced, whispering that I was still the woman who had once lost herself in someone else's shadow. It was during one of these moments, as I was closing up the gallery late one evening, that Daniel appeared. He stood in the doorway, looking smaller than I remembered, his eyes tired and uncertain. For a moment, the old anxiety flared, but I stood my ground, refusing to let him see my fear. "I just wanted to talk," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." He looked at me, searching for forgiveness, for some sign that I would let him back in. But I felt nothing but a calm, resolute peace. "I appreciate that, Daniel," I replied, my voice steady. "But I've moved on. I hope you can too." There was no anger, no bitterness, just closure. He nodded, defeated, and turned to leave. As the door closed behind him, I felt the last thread of our old life snap, freeing me completely. I stood in the quiet gallery, surrounded by the art and the people and the life I had built for myself. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the heartbreak, The betrayal, the long, slow climb back to myself. I realized that every moment, every struggle had shaped me into the woman I was now, strong, resilient, and unafraid to claim her own happiness. I never imagined where this would lead. I never imagined that losing everything would be the thing that finally set me free. But as I looked around at the world I had created, I knew that this was only the beginning. The next chapter was mine to write, and for the first time, I couldn't wait to see what happened next. If you had told me, years ago, that I would one day stand in front of a room full of strangers and share the story of my own heartbreak, I would have laughed or maybe cried. But here I was, the gallery filled with women of all ages, their faces open and expectant, waiting for me to speak. My hands trembled at first, but as I looked out at them, I saw not just curiosity, but recognition. We were all survivors of something: betrayal, disappointment, the slow erosion of self that comes from loving the wrong person too long. I took a deep breath and began. I told them about the girl I used to be, the one who believed that love meant sacrifice, that silence was strength, that happiness was something you earned by making yourself small. I spoke of the years I spent shrinking, apologizing, trying to be enough for someone who would never see me. I told them about the day everything fell apart and the long, lonely nights that followed, when I thought I would never find my way out of the darkness. But I also told them about the turning point, the moment I realized that my life was still my own, that I could choose to fight for myself, even if my voice shook. I shared how I found allies in unexpected places, how I learned to trust my instincts, and how I discovered a strength I never knew I had. I spoke of the courtroom, the fear, the humiliation, and finally, the victory, not just over my ex-husband, but over the part of myself that believed I was powerless. As I spoke, I saw tears in the eyes of women who had come for art but stayed for something more. I saw nods of understanding, hands reaching for friends, and the quiet, fierce hope that maybe, just maybe, they could do it too. When I finished, the applause was gentle but heartfelt, and women lined up to thank me, to share their own stories, to ask for advice or simply a hug. In those moments, I realized that my pain had become something bigger than me, a bridge, a beacon, a promise that no one has to walk this path alone. Life after betrayal is not a straight line. There are days when the old wounds ache, when doubt creeps in, when the world feels too heavy. But there are also days of laughter, of new love, of quiet mornings and wild, joyful nights. I have learned to celebrate every small victory, to forgive myself for the setbacks, and to trust that healing is not only possible, but inevitable. The gallery has become more than a business. It's a community, a safe haven for women to create, to share, to heal. We host workshops, support groups, and art shows that celebrate resilience and transformation. I see women walk in with their heads down and leave with their eyes shining. And I know that this is the work I was meant to do. Mark is still in my life, steady and kind, but I know now that my happiness does not depend on anyone else. I have learned to love myself first, to honor my own needs and dreams. My friendships are deeper, my laughter louder, my heart more open than I ever thought possible. If you are reading this or listening, or sitting in the back of a crowded room wondering if you have the strength to start over, let me tell you, you do. You are braver than you know, stronger than you feel, and more deserving of happiness than you have ever been told. The road ahead may be hard, but you are not alone. There is a whole world waiting for you on the other side of heartbreak, a world you get to shape, to fill with your own light. As I look to the future, I see endless possibility. I see new art, new friendships, new adventures. I see a woman who is no longer afraid to take up space, to speak her truth, to demand the life she deserves. I see hope, not as a distant dream, but as a daily practice, a choice I make every morning when I open my eyes. This is not the end of my story. It is only the beginning. And if you are standing at the edge of your own new chapter, know that I am cheering for you. We are all cheering for you. The best is yet to come.